basically, if you live unsustainably for too long, your society will die. By definition, if you are being unsustainable, you will die, and the only alternative is mass migration. That's what history has shown us time and again.
Welcome to the Green Urbanist, podcast for urbanists fighting climate change. I'm Ross. Today's episode is a conversation with Ran Boydell. Ran has studied and practiced architecture in the UK and his native Australia for over 3 decades, with particular emphasis on sustainability, heritage and rural architecture. Today, Ran is passionate about delivering on zero carbon targets, implementing the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and working across disciplines and industry sectors to help drive a rapid and radical transition to a sustainable economy. He was a founder of Architects Declare in Australia. He teaches university courses on sustainable development and is a pioneer of sustainable homes for the mass market through his ecohus brand, which is spelled ECOHUS. So Ran wrote this fascinating article a couple of months ago that went a bit viral actually, about how climate change is starting to affect buildings in ways that we hadn't previously imagined. We begin actually the conversation talking about this, but you can also read the full article, which I link to in the episode description. After this, we move on to talking about the practical challenges and innovations needed to roll out a nationwide retrofit program to make existing buildings more energy efficient. Now, if you're not aware, retrofitting existing buildings, particularly on a very large scale, is actually a really, really important part of any country really achieving that net zero carbon target. Basically what that does is it just reduces energy demand in a very big way across the country, and it makes it much easier then to switch the grid over to renewable energy. So this is actually a really, really important topic, and it's one that many countries are grappling with because it's such a challenge. So this is something Ran is really interested in, and we talk a lot about the practicalities of that and the things that we need to start doing to actually make that a reality. So really fascinating conversation. If you're quite new to this podcast and you want to understand where does this retrofit thing fit into the bigger picture, you can actually go all the way back to episode number 1 that was released back in 2020. This is a really interesting conversation. We also go off on a couple of tangents, talk about really interesting stuff. And if you want to contact Ran, you can have a look at his details in the show description, the episode description. Green Urbanist, also on social media, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn. You can have a look at that stuff in the show description as well. But for now, please enjoy this conversation with Ran. Thank you, Ran, for joining me here on the Green Urbanist podcast. It's great to have you.
Great to be here, Ross. Enjoying it.
Please just tell us a bit about who you are and what it is you do.
Okay, my name's Ran Boydell. I'm an architect registered in Australia, and I have a particular interest in sustainable design and how we can make a rapid and radical transition to a low carbon built environment.
Excellent. One of the things that I guess piqued my interest in having you on was that you wrote a really interesting article for The Conversation titled "Most Buildings Were Designed for an Earlier Climate. Here's what will happen as global warming accelerates." Please tell us what will happen.
Yeah, well, apart from just my architectural practice, I also do some teaching at Heriot-Watt University. And I really enjoy that. I find I get as much from the students and from the research I can do with them as I can hopefully contribute to their education. And as part of that, someone suggested I might like to consider trying to write something for The Conversation. And I did a few articles and we had a few readers and that was all fun. And then I was inspired to put this one on. And suddenly we had over 50,000 readers and picked up by
Oh,
the
wow.
World Bank and by TED Talks and all sorts of people. I'm even getting an Italian translation, I gather.
Incredible. Well done.
That was how we made contact, really. And what it demonstrated to me was the latent interest in exactly what these details are about climate change in the built environment and how it's going to affect us. I think we all too readily dismiss most people's attitude to this sort of stuff as not really being interested or not really wanting to know. And I think quite the contrary. I think people are desperate for advice, and for advice they can trust. And that's the hardest thing, people knowing what they can trust and what not. But to answer your specific question, what are the impacts? The obvious ones are things like overheating and flooding. And, we're seeing that in all the news broadcasts around the world as we speak. In fact, the bushfires in Greece, the flooding that we've seen in so many countries such as Germany lately, the big heat dome, as they called it, over North America. All those things are evidence of the overheating and the flooding. But I think the thing I was trying to get at in that article is those are the sort of easy things. Those are the things we can pretty readily get our head around. And the solution to overheating can be as simple as being able to open your window wide. None of it's difficult. It's just stuff we haven't been used to doing, or it's been a very local sort of context for stuff. Yeah. But the things we're not really talking about yet are the bigger implications, which are the things like how subsidence is likely to increase significantly as we get higher rainfall, higher heat events. So soils, particularly clay soils, are going to become more unstable. So there's one particular bit of research by the British Geological Federation, I think it's called, where they're suggesting that by 2050, 10% of buildings in the UK will be subject to subsidence to some degree.
And that basically means they'll be sinking,
yes.
Right?
Sinking and heaving. I mean, basically what it means, the ground is moving underneath you to some extent. It might be sinking as in a subhole just opening up, or it might just be the expanding and then shrinking that you get from clay soils when you get them very wet and then they dry out again. So it might just be cracking, but it might be, big holes opening up as well. And I'm always careful not to be alarmist about this. I don't think being alarmist helps. The impacts might be small. They might just be some cracking. But, none of us wants to see our house cracking, no matter how small that might be.
Is that what happened with that apartment building in Miami a few weeks ago? The ground was subsiding.
Yeah.
And basically collapsed.
Yeah, I think
suddenly
the jury's still out on that one. And again, you want to be hesitant and very careful stepping into saying what it was. But subsidence is certainly one of the things that came up. And I gather that there has been, proper data to support the fact that it has been subsiding over recent decades. And the thing I particularly struck me was about concrete spoiling, or what sometimes called concrete cancer, which is most concrete in buildings isn't just concrete, it's reinforced concrete, so it's got steel inside it. And it's the steel that actually makes it so super strong. It's not just the concrete in itself.
Okay.
And if the steel is deep enough in the concrete, it doesn't rust because the moisture can't get through the concrete to make the steel rust.
Sure.
But if this concrete starts to crack and you get water going in through the cracks, or if the water gets saturated because of groundwater levels rising, then your steel does start to rust. And as it rusts, it expands, and that's causing the cracking. And one of the things, well, both of those things are suggestions for Miami. One is a rising water table because of rising sea levels, which is going to make the foundations in a damper environment than they were designed for. And the other one is something called carbonation, which is where the calcium in the cement reacts with carbon dioxide in the air to create a different chemical compound within the concrete. And there's two ways to look at that. And there has been people talking it up in saying, actually, that will help draw carbon out of the atmosphere. Can we actually use concrete to draw carbon out of the atmosphere? And I think that's probably unlikely. But what it does is it makes the steel rust faster because it changes the pH in the concrete and the steel rusts faster. So where concrete cancer has been a big problem in lots of cities around the world, it could potentially become a bigger problem. Right. So back to that building in Miami, jury's out. The general consensus is it was probably built with poor quality materials and not with good workmanship when it was built 40 years ago.
Yeah.
But it's managed to stand up to hurricanes and floods and everything else until now. So what's changing? Why might it not continue to stand up to them? And of course, it collapsed not in a hurricane or anything else. It just collapsed.
Just one day, just fell. Yeah, incredible. I think that is a more insidious effect of climate change that I think people possibly don't consider, because we think about the big dramatic events like extreme floods, extreme heat waves. And we forget that, these things can sort of happen silently as well.
That's just it. And there's a bit of a Western Hemisphere mentality in that too, is, we just think we're immune from those sort of things. We think we've got all our quality standards and everything else, which means we're not susceptible. But actually the editor for the conversation picked out a quote in the article from the mayor in the Miami suburb where this collapsed. And I thought it was really telling. It said, this just doesn't happen. You don't see buildings fall down in America. And that really gets to the point, which is climate change doesn't respect boundaries. It doesn't respect how wealthy or poor you might be or otherwise. There is no national border to where climate change will impact us. And I think that's something which, in a way, it makes us in the 1% or the Western world or however you want to call it, it actually makes us almost more vulnerable, because it's our big complex techno buildings which are actually more at risk than a simple mud hut.
Right.
Yeah, which is, there are all sorts of issues wrapped up in that, of course, but certainly our big complex buildings are more vulnerable to these sorts of changes than, shall we say, more vernacular architecture.
Yeah, more complexity leads to less resilience as a kind of principle, doesn't it?
Yeah, resilience is absolutely the right word there.
Yeah, fascinating. I mean, is there anything we can do about it? I'm thinking in particular about the concrete cancer. Is that just something we have to learn to adapt to, or what? How can we prevent
maintenance? It's concrete cancer has been around ever since reinforced concrete's been around, and it's good maintenance. And if cracks start to appear, that you get in and repair them quickly before they get worse, because they can get worse very quickly the more they rust. So, and this is where I say I don't want to be a doom and gloom merchant. I don't want to catastrophize this thing. But it means that, for example, lots of concrete buildings out there, we're going to have to be more proactive in our maintenance and repair of those buildings than we have been to date. And where buildings that, if you're far enough away from the sea so you don't have salt spray and that sort of stuff as well, traditionally you could think you were pretty much immune from having to worry about that sort of thing too much. That zone's going to expand.
Right. Fascinating. Yeah. So it is, we need to start just thinking about things we haven't necessarily had to worry about before, but there is solutions. As you said, it's maintenance, it's being proactive. So it's more of like a culture shift in for the professionals that are looking after these buildings.
It is
rather than any new technology.
It is a culture shift. And, at that point, I'll throw in a little thought that came to me last night. Watching the closing ceremony of the Olympics, I'm a bit of a sucker for the Olympics. I'm not a sports nut otherwise, but just the sheer joy and intensity of the athletes competing, I find compelling. And the analogy I came up with was, we're not lacking in capacity. we have all the solutions to this stuff. We know what we're doing. We know how to fix concrete cancer and all of that other stuff. What we need is a cultural change. We have to change our attitude to how we do these things. And it just struck me actually that the Olympic culture, that culture of competition, but also of camaraderie and teamwork, of being vulnerable in the face of defeat, which, 9 out of 10 of the athletes there fail. It's that whole thing, that cultural attitude is a very good metaphor for the approach we need to take to climate change. We need to take it serious. We need to make it an absolute focus and dedication and commitment to what we're doing. But we've also got to be open and generous and sharing enough and collaborating to just get on with it together. I just think, to me, that struck a nice metaphor about how our cultural attitudes need to change around climate change.
Yeah, that's really well said. It's a nice sort of metaphor to use as well. With regard to the subsidence, I did an episode a good few months ago about Jakarta, which is the fastest sinking city in the world, has the title, and that's due to not only sea level rise but also the fact that it is subsiding at a significant rate year on year, and so you've got this double action. So that's the sort of another way, I guess, that the effects of climate change get exacerbated as it goes along. So like the effects of climate change aren't on a linear upward curve; they're actually what's the word I'm looking for?
Exponential.
They go up like a exponential, exactly. They actually get exponentially worse.
And you've got those different things that lie into it. So, like you say, it was sinking anyway. And Venice has been sinking for centuries. It's part of how the world works. It's just when you overlay that with the impacts of climate change as well, that different things start to come in. And I know because only this year or last year, the Indonesian government announced they were going to relocate their capital to a different island because of that. So you start to see the sort of very broad scale impacts on how socioeconomic things that can come from that.
Yeah, and I mean there is other cities that have had this issue, like Hong Kong. I guess the difference is that Hong Kong had a strong enough public sector that was able to put a halt to the groundwater extraction and find other ways of supplying water. Indonesia doesn't seem to be as capable of doing that because there's a lot of, we'll say, maybe not illegal, but unregulated water extraction going on, and people don't necessarily have another way of supplying their water needs. So there's other driving factors to do with, how wealthy a nation is, how democratic they are, and that kind of thing.
Absolutely. And I'm from Australia originally, and Indonesia and Australia are the closest neighbours. Australia has a population of 25 million people on a huge piece of land. Indonesia has a population of over 100 million people on this tiny little bunch of islands. So you got to look 25, 50 years down the track and say, well, will a whole lot of those people actually be wanting to live over there because of what's happening? And you get into the whole issues of, will mass migration have to come out of some of the replications of that, and that feeds across into so many different aspects of life too.
Yeah, the climate refugee issue, which is a new term, and it's not even a term that is necessarily accepted by many people. Is there such a thing as a climate refugee? Some people make the case that we have already seen them, but scientists are warning that we will see millions and millions of people displaced by climate change in the coming years. I know this isn't something we necessarily plan to talk about, but I think it's something maybe we should be talking about more as a community.
We should be, and actually it's normal. It's completely normal. I mean, this was something I realised in my teaching work, looking at the whole idea of the Anthropocene. And it made me realise that a sustainable civilization is our normal way. We've been living in an unsustainable way for the last, 200, 300, whatever years. But basically, if you live unsustainably for too long, your society will die. By definition, if you are being unsustainable, you will die. And the only alternative is mass migration. That's what history has shown us time and again. And we're living in more enlightened times and everything else, but those same fundamental drivers still apply.
Fascinating. Okay, I want to maybe shift gear a little bit and talk about some of the work that you're doing around retrofitting existing buildings. So I've talked about this previously on the podcast, the importance of making our existing building stock less energy intensive, because obviously that reduces the amount of energy you need, and therefore it's much easier to supply that then in renewables and to move away from a fossil fuel based energy grid. So very, very important component. It's a lot more difficult than it sounds to just retrofit all the buildings in a country to be more energy efficient. What, from your work, what are some of the challenges and also the opportunities, I guess, of kind of rolling this out on a big scale?
It's simply the scale. It's the scale and the complexity and the diversity of it. If we're looking at new builds, making a new build to, for instance, passive house standards, it's pretty cut and dry. There's a pretty well-established formulas for what you have to do to build to that standard. The additional cost is really pretty minimal. Some would say there's no additional cost at all. It's just about a different design approach. But there was one webinar recently where somebody said the estimated difference was about £5,000. So we'll take that as a figure. Whereas if you are retrofitting an existing house, the estimated cost is maybe £25,000. And whether you're retrofitting a house that's built today in 5 or 10 or 15 years' time, or you're retrofitting a house that's already 100 years old, it's still going to be something around that order of magnitude. So every house that we build today, which is not to net zero standards, is going to have to be retrofitted at some point in the future. So we're storing up trouble there. But the comparison with retrofit is not only is it more expensive, but it's more complicated, because you haven't just got one system that you can come and apply as you can in new build. There's going to be a different solution for every different sort of house type and every different construction type, and what materials you can get easily in your area. And so it becomes a very complex thing. And it's the sheer scale of it. So the generally accepted figures for our housing stock is that by 2050, about 80% of the houses will be houses that already exist today. And you can quote that figure in different ways, but the point is the vast majority of buildings that we're going to be living in down the track are buildings that already exist. And in that context, retrofit is really, really important, quite apart from new build. In the scheme of things, it's retrofit is probably more important, you would say, in a way than what the new build are.
Yeah, I agree.
And if you look at that scale of things, for one study we did locally, if you take that 25,000 odd pounds per house figure for retrofitting, and you said, okay, we're going to retrofit all 25, 26 million whatever houses in Britain over the next 25 years. So, reasonable time span, all that sort of thing. If you do the maths of that, that's about 50% again of the entire current house building and maintenance industry. So this isn't not just a little step change. This is a whole new industry sector. It's huge. Incredible. By the same token, at the end of that 25-year period, that industry disappears. You've done all the houses, it's gone.
Yes.
So there's a huge challenge, there's a huge opportunity, but it doesn't fit our current business models. It doesn't fit our current skills and training model. There's a whole different approach we need to take in how we're going to deliver on that. And we're only been fiddling around the edges. There are lots of great examples of retrofit projects that have happened. Some of the social housing landlords have been really proactive on it, and there has been government money going into that stream of things. So there are good examples, but they're only a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of the scope of work that we need to do.
So how do we scale it up then? Is it a question of money, or or the training, the knowledge?
Back to that culture versus capacity thing. It's both. Yeah, and actually, I mean, it's for me that's a very interesting question, because that's at the heart of this local research that we've been doing, is how can we look at that in terms of a local economy. So it's everything from actually you need to go into the schools and start talking to young kids at school and letting them know what's going on in this industry to try and entice them into a career when they leave school to go down that path. It's talking to council planning and building officers so that they have an awareness of this sort of stuff. And we look at the vast majority of councils across the UK have now declared a climate emergency. Well, I think it's the majority. It's at least it's a big number have.
Yeah.
So the question becomes, well, what are you doing about it? How are you training your staff? How are you changing your policies to do this sort of stuff? It's supply chains. One of the big things is our current approach to retrofit, or the materials that we typically use for retrofit and new build. A lot of them are actually very high in embodied carbon. So whilst they might make our houses more energy efficient and we use less energy, actually we're sticking a hell of a lot of embodied carbon into the building in the first place to make that happen. And the carbon payback on that could be decades. So all of the different sorts of foam insulation which are used now, generally they're petrochemical derived. So they actually have a huge embodied carbon, and they directly relate to oil and natural gas production or use. Whereas there are lots of different insulation materials made out of plant fibres, wood fibre, that sort of thing, which we could be using instead. And that also then you roll that on, you talk about things like circular economy, about reuse of materials and reuse of waste resources. But you can also start to talk about local economy and local manufacturing. So how can we have decentralised manufacturing facilities to make these sorts of things, which generates local employment, which reduces the transport miles to get these things to where you need them. All sorts of issues roll into that. That if you can take an integrated approach, if you can join the dots across all these different things, you can make a win-win-win situation out of it. Whereas at the moment we're still taking a pretty myopic view of we just need to improve energy efficiency, not realising those other things.
The carbon intensity of the retrofitting materials that you use is something I hadn't considered before, actually. But of course, because you have to add more material when you're insulating something, and it seems like that whole industry must have an expiry date now if it's relying on petrochemicals, and we're phasing these out. It really, they can only do that for another few decades until they'll be forced to switch into more sustainable things that are actually available.
It's a tough one because in some cases you get better insulation with a thinner product with those than you would with a natural fibre. So there are some instances where it's very difficult to find an alternative to the foam-based ones and so on. And you also get the fire issue. So, I mean, everything around the whole tragedy of Grenfell Tower and so on is fundamentally to do with the insulation products that we used. And so that industry has been through upheaval over the last few years dealing with that issue as well. And some of the bigger companies have changed the products that they use entirely, so that their insulation boards now are much more fire resistant and much better performance environmentally for these sorts of things. There's one company I know who make a foam board using recycled vegetable oils instead of fossil fuel oils going into it. But they still need the chemical reagents of whatever description to make the oil turn like popcorn into foam. And so whilst the recycled vegetable oil is a lovely big green tick in the box, actually you still have a toxic product to the environment.
Oh, yikes.
So, but you're absolutely right that the industry transition over the next decade or so, it is going to see huge. It's going to see some industries which 5 years ago would have expected to be big contributors to reducing inefficiency and that sort of thing, find themselves right out on the wrong end of the branch.
Right.
And they're going to have to pivot, or whatever business term you might like to use to stay in that game.
It's clearly a sector that will require innovation quite quickly. I mean, I think any material scientists or engineers who this could be a place for some people who are very forward thinking to come in and kind of revolutionize the space to an extent, because it's tricky. It's always the thing when we talk about sustainability and climate change. It's just never simple. There's never one lever you can pull to solve the question. You have to think things through all the way to the end, and often you'll find more and more issues as the deeper you look.
Yeah, somebody I heard the term say sustainability is messy, and it's stuck with me ever since, because there is no one size fits all answer to any of this. It comes down to a bespoke solution to every situation you come across.
I suppose something that is interesting and is perhaps something to be optimistic about with regard to retrofitting is the fact that it is sort of decentralized. And in terms of the social benefit, in terms of spreading employment, will be equally spread around the country. Wherever there's homes, you'll need local tradespeople and, I suppose, relatively local manufacturing to do that. And so that, I mean, this is one of the things that people would argue for with regards to like a Green New Deal, or some of the co-benefits of taking drastic action on climate change. It means you actually create a lot more jobs. They're just not necessarily the jobs that exist right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, I mean, again, back to the local project we were doing here in the Scottish Borders, that was very much the conclusion we were getting to. And actually, just within the last week, we've been in contact with a similar group in the Midlands who have are quite advanced in their strategy for how to do this. And I think they were actually quite excited to be in touch with us, because we all think we're doing this on our own. And suddenly you find there are other people doing the same thing, which is so encouraging. And so they're looking at obviously in the Midlands a very dense urban context for how you do this, whereas here in the Scottish Borders we're looking for a much more rural, isolated, decentralised way where there are different drivers and different forces at play. But yeah, very much the same thing. So their approach, from what I know of it, is they're getting funding together to do 10 houses as a project. Just stop talking about it. Stop trying to come up with policy. Just do it. Just get in, do 10 houses, see what the issues are, and extrapolate from there about how you can upscale. But they had a similar integrated approach, looking at local manufacture, looking at skills and training and all that sort of stuff within the mix.
Yeah, that is great to hear that people are working on this. I think something that kind of shocked me, a couple of months ago, I was working on a particular project with a local authority, and we were talking about, they were putting together a climate change plan, and we were talking about their infrastructure and that kind of thing. And I said, well, what about retrofitting buildings? Obviously, that will be a key part. What are you doing to sort of further that along in planning terms? And the guy I was talking to in the local authority said, I just don't see how that's an important thing to think about. And obviously no one had ever explained to him. He had never been trained in how important this is. And he just sort of, when he heard it, he just thought, oh, I've never heard of that. It's probably not important. So I think there is unfortunately quite a lot of that still. And I mean, I guess that's part of the purpose of why I'm doing this podcast, is to try and help people in the industry, understand the big picture, all the various things at play. And
it's fantastic you're doing this podcast, and that's the thing. It's when people like you speak out about this sort of stuff and open up the discussion, that a lot of people will have their thoughts challenged, or their ears will prick up, or they think, I was thinking I should do something like that. We a couple of years ago, when we had some grant funding to pursue some of this stuff, we commissioned a public opinion survey. So we got one of the companies who do that sort of stuff, and normally they do opinion polls about consumer goods, disposable nappies, what beer you like,
Okay.
that sort of thing. And we got them to do a survey for us about people's attitude to sustainable housing. And it was a really interesting exercise. It took them a while to get their head around it, about what questions we should be asking. But actually then when they put it out and got the responses, they were getting people coming back saying, this is the most interesting survey we've ever done. Why aren't all the builders building like this anyway? And one of the really interesting things about that was, again, that idea that, people aren't interested in this, they don't care. And that was so obviously wrong, because we were getting some really nuanced responses to the questions we were asking. People were obviously clued into what was going on here, and they were really pleased to be able to be asked for their opinion about it and to see what happens. And what made me think of that was one of the questions, or one of the way the marketing company framed the question was, what will get you talking about this around the water cooler at work? Now, it's a long time since any of us have been around the water cooler at work now. But, the principle still applies. What is it that would just get you talking about this sort of sustainability stuff in your day-to-day discussion about things, just as much as you talk about the football or what's on Coronation Street, or, I don't know, whatever.
And did you get any good data on that? Or?
Well, we did. And it was, the interesting thing was when we started to look at how that fitted within a broader context. And one of the surveys that I often quote is one by the Danish, I think it's the Danish energy company Ørsted, and they did something they called their Green Barometer. And it was a survey of 26,000 people in 13 countries, I think the statistics were. And one of the most interesting things that came out about that was the vast majority of people, as in 70, in some cases I think it was over 80%, said that they would be proud of their country if they were ambitious in their renewable energy targets.
Wow.
So it wasn't just, we think this is a good idea. They said we would be proud of our country. We would be really pleased to be pursuing this. And so the question that comes up there is, if people are saying that, why are politicians and corporations still rolling out the line that people won't buy it, people don't support it? Because all the evidence of the opinion polls is that they do want it. And what the answer to that one is, I don't know. But there's I could quote you a dozen different statistics about that. There was a fantastic poll, or it wasn't a fantastic poll, it was an interesting poll that YouGov did about climate engineering. So, can we reflect the sun's rays back up to all that sort of stuff?
Yeah.
And it had half a dozen different climate engineering things that we could do, starting with plant more trees. And the response rate to plant more trees was 93% yes. Now, my understanding of statistics is if you get 93%, that's basically unanimous, So we can all agree we should plant more trees. Back to the question, why aren't we just planting more trees? It's sort of...
Why do you have to ask people this?
Exactly.
Everyone loves trees.
I'm not so sure about sowing sulfates in the ocean or planting things in the clouds, but I can cope with let's plant more trees.
So interesting. I think about the housing market, and we're talking about we'll say house builders or developers might think there's no market for more sustainable homes, this kind of thing. I think it's difficult with the housing market, particularly in the UK, because it just doesn't operate like a normal product. It's not like a car where you have the ability to choose from a range of different providers. Whatever city you're in, you can buy from tons of different people, lots of different specs, electric, hybrid, petrol, whatever. You always have a choice, and then you can go to the secondhand market. So as a consumer, you have a lot more freedom to push them for particular innovations, that kind of thing. With housing, it's different because we have such a chronic housing shortage in the UK. People just take what they can get and feel lucky to be able to afford any home. never mind, putting pressure on the house builders to do a better job. So I think relying on the people who are building homes to take these consumer demands, I suppose, or consumer preferences seriously. I mean, they just won't, because they know whatever they build will get sold, because there's such a shortage economy.
The problem is the UK housing market, and to some extent the housing market in most developed countries have similar problems, or just variations on that same problem. Yes, there was a housing crisis. There's been a housing crisis for, 10 years or more, at least, long before climate change really became part of the general consciousness. And that's back to where we need, you can wrestle with the terms, but we need some disruptors in the market. Well, we need to create some discontinuity in the market around this. There was an interesting article I read just yesterday, talking about Tesla, and about how the interesting thing with Tesla is it wasn't just bringing a new sort of car to the market. It was actually disrupting all sorts of aspects to it. They don't have dealers in the way that traditional car makers have dealerships. The way the cabin is designed is a whole new take on what you actually need at your fingertips in the cabin, rather than what was there before. So on one hand, you can look at it and it still just looks like a car. But on the other hand, the whole infrastructure, the whole network behind how it's made and distributed and maintained and everything else is very, very different to what the traditional structure has been. And that's my bigger ambition for what I'd like to get involved with in the housing market, is to say, look, I can build you a house which looks just like that house built by one of the major house builders now. I can build it for a comparable price, not necessarily exactly the same, but a comparable price to what they can build. But beyond that, I want to do it for you in a development which also delivers on broader environmental and social gains, on biodiversity, on community planning and all those sorts of things. And I want to do it in a way which is going to ensure fuel poverty isn't an issue, because they're all built to passive house standards. And if you're in passive house standards, basically your body heat is enough to keep everybody warm most of the year, even in our cold climate. So, it's delivering across that broad range of things. And, that's the fine line. A great reference point I find is actually there was a house built in Nottingham called the New Autonomous House, built in the late 80s, early 90s by architects Robert and Brenda Vale. And it's a full-on sustainable house. It's off-grid, even though it's in the city centre for electricity and that sort of thing. But it's in a conservation area, and the heritage plan has said you will have to comply with heritage guidelines. So if you walk past it in the street, you'd think it might be medieval. It just looks like an old house. But it's totally energy efficient, water efficient, all those sorts of things. And what the architect said was, we knew we were going to be challenging people enough in terms of the technology we're using. We didn't want to challenge them aesthetically as well. So we just accepted whatever aesthetic preferences the market or the council planning officer, whoever was going to give to us. But we're going to make sure it performs 110%. And I think so much of the existing housing market, they are fixated on certain ideas about aesthetics and the gizmos you have to provide, or the fancy kitchen upgrade or whatever. And yes, people respond to that, and that's all good and well, but that's all secondary, and you can still do all that, but make sure your building performs in the first place.
Yeah.
And so that's a long, rambling answer to the question you put out. But we need a few sort of Tesla type disruptors in the housing market to disrupt that pattern. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely agree with that. There was something you mentioned to me when we had our previous chat, which was a concept you called sustainable value engineering. Can you talk us through that?
Yeah. Value engineering is a term that most people in the construction industry or some form will be familiar with, but the rest of the world would probably not have a clue about. But
Okay.
the concept of value management, as I understand it, came about after the Second World War within, I think, mostly North American companies, and they were dealing with resource shortages and tight costs and everything else after the war. And so it was this idea that you look at the design that you've got, and then you go through a process to see how you could source different resources to make it the same way, or how you could improve its performance by tweaking things a bit. And so the intention of it was really getting the most bang for your buck, to
Right.
keep tweaking the design, tweaking the supply chains, to constantly improve your offering and reduce costs to your ultimate customer, whoever that was. And it became quite an established sort of school of thought and was picked up a lot in Europe in that time as well. So that's often referred to as value management, and there are all sorts of examples of that at play, from NASA and spaceships down to simple manufacturing things. And then in construction, that got translated into value engineering. But the problem was, rather than it being trying to improve the quality of what you produced and just minimize your resource use, it is generally now considered a cost-cutting exercise. So a
Right.
builder will come in, especially if it's a design and build contract, and they'll say, well, I can strip out this, 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 and this, and it will still deliver you the same basic building. And, so it has very negative connotations for the most part in
Yeah.
construction. But the principles behind it are sound. And it ties into another point, which is, how do we find value? And there are lots of different organisations out there who are talking about values. Forum for the Future, Construction Industry Hub. There are all sorts of places where they say we need to think about value differently. And so if instead of value, you don't just say financial value, you say, well, what's the environmental value? What's the social value? What's the carbon saving we can do? So the question then becomes, well, how do we define value, or what values is it we define as being important? And once you've defined those, and those might be different for any sort of building or product, those values you define might be different in a certain context, perhaps in an area of multiple deprivations. There might be some social values which are really important for your project to try and address. Carbon reduction is obviously one we would say across the board is a value that we need to be mindful of. So the idea we've been kicking around with sustainable value engineering is, how can we create a framework so that at any point through the design and construction process, when we have to make a decision about a particular material that we're going to use or a particular design strategy that we're going to employ, how can we simply do an assessment of that which doesn't look just at the cost, but looks at these other values, which looks at environmental, social values of these things, and give some sort of quantitative comparison that we can make between those. And yes, the financial value is always going to be there, but hopefully the financial value will be secondary to those other aspects. And I suppose importantly too, the financial value's got to be considered in terms of whole life cost, not just how much it's going to cost to build. So I haven't quite got it into a more structured format than that, but we're working on an article for that, and I've had a lot of help from and advice from people about how we can frame that up more. So hopefully we'll get something out on that in the next couple of months.
It's a bit like what gets measured gets managed,
Yes.
because it can be very hard to quantify social value and often environmental value also, if there's a way you could sort of put those in a measurable format. it's never going to be perfect, but it gives people something to aim for and gives them a way of conceptualizing it. I guess it's a bit easier.
And the simplest one of those is embodied carbon, because that is actually something we can calculate very easily. We just haven't been used to doing it. But if you've got a bill of quantities for your building, all you've got to do is stick in an extra column for the relative embodied carbon of each of those materials, and you instantaneously have a bill of quantities for your carbon emissions. It is that simple. We can make it all very complicated, but it isn't. There's a whole complicated backstory about all the manufacturers compiling reliable data about what the embodied carbon of their products is. But when it lands on the desk of the architect or the engineer or the quantity surveyor, actually once they know what they're doing, it's very straightforward. And the joys of computer-aided drafting and BIM, the building information monitoring, modelling software and so on, actually it does it all for you. If you've built your architectural model in a BIM program, it gives you the bill of quantities, and there are now at least dozens, if not hundreds, of different software programs around the world that will calculate your embodied carbon for you as a direct dump from a BIM model. And at the same time, they're actually sucking in the data from the manufacturers. So they've got real time data for what each specific product has in that. Whereas to date, we've only had sort of generic industry standards for how much embodied carbon in a piece of steel or a bag of concrete or something.
That's true. I suppose it is having some sort of a figure is better than nothing. But I suppose you have to be mindful that sometimes the figures are not particularly accurate. If you multiply that out across a 20-story building, obviously you could be quite far off what your actual emissions are.
That's exactly that. And that feeds back into the sustainable value engineering side of things as well, because what that process should be able to do is to provide encouragement and incentive to find lower carbon materials to substitute within that process. And that's where just having generic industry data isn't actually helpful, because you need to know, if I get it from this supplier to this specification from this site, which is 10 miles down the road from me, I'm going to reduce my embodied carbon by so much. The more detail we can feed into that calculation, the more helpful it is to make meaningful change to our design habits.
We've talked about a lot of interesting, I suppose, methods of working, potential new innovations, that kind of thing. Do you think this stuff has to come from the private sector, or do you think it needs to be sort of legislated for or regulated?
Yeah, I mean the easy answer is all of the above.
Everything at once.
It's. One way it's been characterised is that regulations are really important, and I would never say not to improve regulations for energy efficiency or not to add embodied carbon as one of the mandatory things that we have to be assessed against for new buildings. But regulations are also generally characterised as a race to the bottom. It's then what's the minimum we can do to get across the threshold, and the evidence of that comes from what's called SAP calculations now. So they're the calculations you have to do for any new building in Britain about energy performance. SAP stands for Standard Assessment Procedure, but it's a way of calculating the overall energy performance of your building. And you have to reach a certain threshold, and it's different in England, Wales and Scotland and so on, but they all use that same system. I know from discussions with various of the big timber frame manufacturers that if one of the major house builders on a project is adding, for instance, solar panels to the roof of the house or something like that, that will give a boost to their SAP calculation. And if it boosts their SAP calculation above the minimum threshold more than they want to, they will reduce the amount of insulation going into the building so that it only just passes. I've been told it enough times to not
Yeah.
even say that's anecdotal. I just know that happens.
Yeah.
So,
Of
yeah.
course.
So instead of a race
course.
to the bottom, we need a race to the top. And regulations will never give you a race to the top. In a market economy, what gives you a race to the top is actually the market incentive. Is to think actually the market's going to buy your product because you're going for the top quality thing. And there was another line I often quote is from Christiana Figueres, who was the UN head of negotiations for the Paris climate agreements. And at the time in 2019, when the UK changed its Climate Change Act from an 80% reduction by 2050 to 100% by 2050, in other words, to net zero, she made the comment that removing that 20% exemption was key. Because up until that point, everybody would argue why they should be part of that exemption, why their industry shouldn't have to get to net zero. And she said the way business works, as soon as you know you have to do something, as soon as you know there's no out clause for you, then you do actually get to race to the top. Then you do think, actually, how can I get there first so I can beat my competitor to it? And so she said, and I therefore predict, mark my words, that we will get there sooner than 2050 because of that business incentive. And I hope she's right. And actually, if you look at the electric car market and how quickly that's changing, towards the end of last year, all the big names were falling over themselves to talk about how quickly they were going to transition their fleet to EVs. I take that as positive evidence of that starting to happen.
Fascinating. Very insightful. Thank you. Time has flown by. We've been talking for almost an hour. I can move on to the final question, but I just wanted to check with you if there was anything else you wanted to bring up, you wanted to mention.
No, my key point is simply this is all doable. This is all stuff. I've been in this business for 30 years, and I talk to lots of people who've been in it for longer than me. Nothing we're talking about now wasn't being talked about 30 years ago. We're not waiting for new technologies. The technologies we need are proven. We can do this using readily available building materials in standard construction techniques. It's all completely doable. It's just changing the design emphasis we put on how we build new or how we retrofit buildings.
And that culture of how you deliver things, how you design things.
And that culture is changing. It's still the minority, but I'm so encouraged by the discussions that are happening, certainly within the architecture profession, and to the extent that I'm having it in other professions as well. One of the projects I worked on, we did some workshops with some of what they call the tier one builders, so the biggest corporate building companies in the UK, and without fail, they were all saying, look, we'll do it. If you tell us what you want, we'll build it. That's what builders are good at. We might not be good at innovation, but if you tell us what you want, we'll figure out the cheapest, quickest way of doing it for you. And so that puts the emphasis back on the big, you said, is it government, is it corporate, whatever. That puts the emphasis back on those big corporate and government clients in the construction industry to ramp up their briefs, ramp up their tender documents significantly, and put it out there comfortable in the knowledge that the builders want to respond. So it does have to come that way round, generally, in the scheme of things.
Brilliant. I want to ask you the final question, which I always ask all the podcast guests. It could be that you've already answered it in the course of the conversation, but I'll give you a chance to make your sort of final point, which is, we're at a pivotal moment in terms of taking action on climate change. From your perspective, what needs to happen or change over the next decade or so to ensure that we're successful?
Yeah, I don't know if I have answered that. That's a huge question on one hand, but and you could just say all of the above of everything that we've talked about in the last hour.
Yeah.
But the starting point is just awareness and it's discussion. There's a thing called Architects Declare or Construction Declares, which started in the UK May 2019, and I was part of getting it out to Australia. But actually, since then, it's now in 26 countries, I think, and 6,000 signatories or something. And all it's doing is acknowledging that buildings are responsible for about 40% of carbon emissions globally, and that we as architects, or indeed anybody in the construction industry, therefore has a key responsibility in mitigating those impacts. And the first point of the declaration is we must talk to our clients. We must talk to the consultants we work with about this. And the starting point is just that, whether you call it the water cooler discussion or at the pub with your mates or with your boss. And it's the other way as well. It's to be open to discussion with younger people. One of the things we realise is particularly in organisations with a very strong hierarchy, there's a tendency for juniors not to speak out or for them not to be listened to.
Yeah.
And we've got to get rid of that one. We've got to be open to any input from any level within our organisations about where benefits could come from. We've got to get out of what's often called the silo mentality, where we just work within our individual disciplines and we don't reach out and talk to our colleagues, because sustainability demands a holistic response, and no one profession can do that by itself. We have to work together and collaboratively on things. Back to that sustainable value engineering idea, if you want to make a meaningful assessment of those values, you will have to talk to other disciplines to identify, what the relative values are. So it's discussion, it's awareness, it's being open to alternative ideas and to be proactive about it. I had to phone my mobile phone company last night or sometime, and the lady very, very happily, and calling me sweetie all the time, helped me out with whatever the problem was that I had. And at the end of it, I said, okay, I'm going to do some market research now. And I said, have you ever heard of a Fairphone? She said, no. And so we went through what a Fairphone is, and it's a mobile phone made using fair trade materials and ... It's repairable, but it just runs standard Android software and stuff. So, and I said to her, well, my next phone I get is going to be an Android. It's going to be a Fairphone. And so unless your company is going to start selling Fairphones by the time I get a new one, I will no longer be one of your customers. So you go and tell your bosses when they're going to start, ask them when they're going to start stocking a Fairphone. And I think it's those sorts of discussions that we can all have in any part of life, is just to raise the general awareness, and that's back to the idea of, cultural change.
I would love to see a more open sort of communicative culture within our profession, architecture, development, urban design, that kind of thing, because I think often we are, I guess this is the same in other industries as well, we're often doing the thing that we did last time, because you can't reinvent the wheel with every project, or else it's just far too much work. You have to take stuff you've already done and adapt it to a new context. Of course, if we keep doing that, we'll never get the level of change that we need very quickly. So it needs someone to step in and say, hold on, let's rethink this from the bottom up. And if I would say as well, if you're a consultant or a practicing architect, part of your role is to educate your client as well. It's not only just to deliver exactly what they want, because often they don't know about the innovations happening in the industry. They don't know about
the first. I tell my students the first job of an architect or a designer of any sort is to challenge their brief. Take your client's brief, but then challenge it and make sure it's actually appropriate to the task at hand, to the issues at hand. Yeah, and I'll give a shout out to Scott McCauley, who I think you've talked about before, and his Anthropocene Architecture School, where he's really full marks to him, been trying to speak out to the architectural education side of things to get it more firmly on the agenda for new students coming out.
I'm going to be having Scott on the podcast later this week, so keep an eye out for his episode.
Absolutely brilliant.
He's really great. Yeah. Thank you so much, Ran. I've really enjoyed this conversation. It's been really interesting for me. Where can people find out more about you online or follow what you do?
There's a holding page for ecohus, ecohus.co.uk is probably the simplest one to ping at that. Or if you just look me up on Twitter, or LinkedIn is where I shout out the most, and it's just Ran Boydell, as you've got on all your stuff here. They'll find me there. And the article we spoke about at the start of all this is on the Conversation website if they want to look there. And I'm very happy.
Excellent.
I mean, the joy of doing things like this with yourself, Ross, the joy of the internet and social media is actually such fantastic platforms to come together and have these sorts of discussions, which were hard enough to do in the flesh before lockdown, let alone now. And so just being able to reach out and share with people, I think, absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, the vast majority of my guests, including yourself, I have never met in real life and may never meet, although hopefully we can at some point. Thank you so much, Ran. I really appreciate it.